Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. So in this video I'm going to show you my setup for September, and as always I'm using my bullet journal by Arch and Olive, and you can use my code ARTandBudgets to get 10% off, which also helps to support me and my channel. Now first I wanted to do a quick flip through of my August setup, which is definitely one of my favorites, and I know I say that all the time, but I like this one especially because it was super simple but also very summery, and there were a lot of fun colors. And I actually ended up doing 5 weekly spreads for this month, the last one including the first 3 days of September, because I was out of town for a little bit in the second to last week, so I didn't have time to film and edit the video then, and so I'm starting my September setup on these 2 pages. Now, as a theme for September, I ended up going for wildflowers, which was originally suggested by Leah on one of my comments, so thank you so much for your suggestion. I thought it was perfect for September since it's kind of summery, but also has a bit of a fall vibe. As for the pens and colors, I only used the Arch and Olive Acrylographs this time. I didn't want to use any black because I wanted it to look light and airy, and as always the products are going to be listed in the description. I mainly used the colors from the warm fall collection and also the yellow from the jewel collection. But of course you could also use markers with similar colors if you don't have them. Then I started off my setup with a small calendar on the left side, again this time with no actual use for it other than just having something to fill this page and also just to have an overview of the whole month, but I won't write anything into it since it's very small. I'm first writing the weekdays on the top with the light purple and the dates underneath with a bluish green, and as for the sizing, the days are 2 spaces wide and then the dates are in 1 row, leaving another row empty in between them, so there's a bit more white space. Into that white space I'm adding some lines for a little bit of separation with the purple and also a bright orange to add a bit more color. Then I also filled the empty spaces on the top and bottom with some little flowers, so I'm using the yellow first in the middle and then adding some simple petals around it, but I actually had to correct the spacing a bit, so I would recommend just starting on the right side and then not adding all of them at once. On the bottom I also added a YouTube and Instagram section, this time just to write down my follower count on the first day of September because I kind of want to get away from focusing on numbers too much. For the cover page I wanted to do a wreath design with the title in the middle, so I'm first using the purple to write September, and I tried to center it in the middle of the circle that I had sketched out beforehand, but it's probably not the exact middle, just kind of like the visual middle, if that makes sense. I wanted to fill the bottom half with a bunch of flowers and little leaves, which overall should taper towards the end, so the middle part is the thickest and it makes a sort of crescent shape. Of course I sketched out everything beforehand just to have a rough placement figured out, and then I started by drawing the flowers, the bigger ones having the yellow in the middle and really small ones without it, and also some small leaves and some little branches to try to fill the space evenly. I think the most important part to make it look clean is to keep the white spaces in between the elements roughly the same size, because otherwise it can look a little bit unbalanced and chaotic. For the flowers I switched between the purple and the orange, but I did make the bigger one with the purple because I wanted it to kind of be the main color. For the leaves I left a small white stripe in the middle, but you can also just fill them out depending on which look you prefer, and for the flower petals I usually did around 6 or 7 for the bigger ones and then 5 for the really small ones. And if you are struggling with placing the petals evenly, just try to kind of place 2 facing each other across the middle, like with 6 petals there are 3 pairs of 2 facing each other. To fill any small gaps, I used the yellow to draw a bunch of little dots everywhere. I'm trying to not overdo it, but I usually just did 2 or 3 together, and then also some bigger ones scattered throughout. For the top half, I used the green to draw the rest of the circle, and then also added some leaves to make it look like little branches, and I also left the very top space empty for another small flower to complete the circle. So that's these first 2 pages all done, and let's move on to my habit trackers. The layout this time is very similar to last month because I really enjoyed having more white space since the habit trackers are very small and the page already looks pretty full. So I first wrote the title on the top left with the purple again, and next to it some more flower doodles as decoration. Again, I made the overall shape kind of taper towards the right side for the doodles this time, and the same principles apply as for the cover page. With this theme, I really like how there are different sizes of elements and how easy you can fill the space evenly because you can always make the flowers smaller or larger, and same goes with the leaves or the little branches. I tried to make sure that the title and the doodle is more or less centered, so I followed the grid spaces as a guide to make sure the flowers didn't look crooked, but it's also pretty easy to balance out the whole shape with the dots. Then for my habit trackers, I first did 6 daily habits as always, and this time I placed them on the right side, leaving 8 spaces empty on the left, but the spacing could be different if you use another bullet journal. I started by making the boxes for the trackers, and I wanted to include the weekdays on the top again, so the sections are 6 spaces tall and 7 spaces wide with 2 in between them. For the borders, I also alternated between the purple and the orange shade, just for a bit of variation. Then I wrote the weekdays in the top row with the green shade, and I used those 3 colors mainly because the yellow was only an accent color, and I really love how they work together since they are all from one set of acrylographs. So if you're ever looking for some color palette inspiration, you can always just look up some of the sets because they always have colors that work together really well in my opinion. Then I also wrote the habits underneath each section in the same color as the border so that it's not too confusing. And on the bottom I'm also adding some weekly habits. I'm writing them with green this time and then adding 5 circles underneath to color in for each week when I complete the habit. Now I did forget to press record here for a bit, but I wanted to fill the left side with a pattern of the flowers and the leaves, so first I used the yellow to mark the center of each flower because it just makes the spacing a bit easier, and I placed them in kind of a zigzag line as you can see, and then I used the orange shade for the left ones and the purple for the ones on the right, so that it's alternating from left to right, but you could also do the first one in one color and then the one next to it in the other color. I think both would look really cute. Next, I also filled the spaces between the flowers with some leaves, making them face in different directions so that it doesn't look too boring. And lastly, I used the yellow again for some little accents. Now for the other page, I'm never really sure what to put here, but this time I wanted to make some sections just to plan out the month of September a little bit. So first again, I'm doing the same thing for the title as for the habits. So I'm writing September on the left side and then adding the flower doodles on the right side. Then for the sections, I first wrote the titles in green, and I made boxes for my to-dos, planning my workouts, YouTube related stuff, self-care, events, and lastly goals for September, and I went for a more simple font to contrast with the other titles. Now, because I didn't want to just have the borders because I thought it would be a bit boring, I decided to add 1 flower and a few leaves in the bottom right corner of each section. And I switched again between the orange and the purple shade, and then I wanted to make the borders in the other color. So for example, with a purple flower, I would do an orange border and so on. I drew the flowers first because I needed to know how much space I would need to leave out for the borders. So this way it's just a bit easier, and then I used a ruler again and made the borders like I mentioned with the other color. The acrylographs do need a few seconds to dry, so I always try to lift my ruler straight up so that I don't smudge the lines, and then I also turn my journal whenever I don't really see where the border needs to stop. So for example, when the title is underneath the ruler and I just can't see it, so that's just a little tip and why I rotate my journal a lot when I make borders. And that is it for these 2 pages, so let's go ahead and make my first weekly spread of September. This time I used a layout where I split each page into 6 small sections that are 11 spaces tall and 11 spaces wide, and then I leave 2 spaces in between them horizontally and 1 space vertically, and this just kind of works out perfectly in my journal, but again it can be different for you, so just try it out beforehand. In this first section, I made another small version of the wreath design from the cover page, and I wrote week 1 into the middle with the purple shade. I didn't include as many flowers because obviously it's a lot smaller, and I didn't want it to be too crowded, but apart from that, everything pretty much stayed the same. Then I started making my daily sections, and I placed Monday to Wednesday on the left page, and I wrote the weekdays and the dates with the green shade because I wanted to use the purple and orange again for the borders. And then I placed Thursday to Sunday on the right page, but of course you can always just place them any which way you want, which I think makes this layout really fun. Again, I wanted to include some doodles for the sections, so I did the exact same thing as for the September sections, adding 1 flower and 3 leaves in the bottom right corners, and again I'm alternating the colors like before. I really love breaking up the more geometric shapes like the square borders with more playful elements, and I thought it was especially fitting for this theme. Then I'm adding the borders again with the orange for the sections with a purple flower and the other way around, which makes the whole spread look a little bit more interesting in my opinion. Next, in the section underneath the small wreath design, I wanted to add a mini calendar, so I'm first writing the weekdays on the top with a green shade and the dates underneath in purple. Then I also added a small flower in the middle on the bottom because I couldn't really place the calendar into the very middle of the section. And lastly, I'm also adding the border with the orange, which worked out perfectly with the daily sections. For the very bottom section, I wanted to add another wreath design, just like the top one, because there are a lot of extra sections to fill with this layout, and I didn't feel like I really needed anything else since I still had 2 more left on the bottom right page, so I just decided to fill it with flowers instead, and wrote September as a title into the middle. I also feel like it balanced out the top a little bit since the wreath design is quite full and it would look a little bit empty on the bottom otherwise. I originally had them in different spots, which you might have noticed in my sketch, but I think it ended up looking a little bit unbalanced, which is why I went for this version. Lastly, for the other 2 sections I mentioned, I did one for next week and one for my goals, and I wrote the title first in green again, but this time into the middle of the section. I also didn't add a flower doodle because I wanted to distinguish them from the daily sections, so I just made a simple border instead. And that is it for this setup. I really love how it turned out, so let's go ahead and do a little flip through. I really love making themes where I don't use any black, and I think it worked out especially well for this one because I think it looks a lot more airy and soft, which is exactly what I was going for. As always, if you have any ideas for themes you would like to see me make, or any questions in general, feel free to leave me a comment down below, and also consider subscribing to my channel if you enjoy my content. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video, so thank you so much for watching as always, and I hope I'll see you again next time. Bye!